Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Salam Islamic Center topic. This week we are with Dr. Hameed El-Amin, a brief history of Muslim African Americans. It's essential that we know about their story because they are the first comers as Muslims to this continent. They made immense contributions to Muslim heritage, Islam's heritage in the US, is well appreciated. And we as Muslims need to be aware of this history, 400 years of history. We have an esteemed guest with us, Dr. Hameed El-Amin. He has his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College and a PhD in clinical and social ecology, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is a recently retired college teacher who has served as a psychology social science instructor and assistant professor of psychology and counseling. Dr. El-Amin has clinical counseling and teaching experience with varied populations from preschool to adult in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Alabama, and Michigan, and lectures across the country and internationally. Dr. El-Amin served as a Combat Infantry Officer in the Vietnam War in the 70s, and also lectures on this subject. Dr. El-Amin currently works with the Sister Clara Muhammed Memorial Education Foundation, Clara Muhammed Schools Consortium, and other organizations supporting interfaith initiatives, Islamic education, and community schools. Dr. El-Amin and wife Linda currently reside in Mount Clemens, Michigan. Welcome here, Dr. El-Amin.
Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Alaikum salam. Great to have you here at this important topic. The past 2 weeks have not been easy. If you can, and it won't be easy for you to tell us a brief history of 400 years of African American Muslims heritage in the US. Now the floor is yours, please.
Yes, alhamdulillah. It's very difficult to summarize the history, but I'm certain that many of you have watched enough of the news to see the current events that are ongoing in our country and across the globe. And the present day events are really almost a summary of our history. We know that history repeats itself. And that is exactly what we're seeing in some ways at the present moment, as we are watching the current events in this very historical context. I go back in my personal life to the origins of the civil rights movement, and age does have its benefits in some cases. So I remember much of this history. In fact, I remember sitting in my great-grandmother's lap, who was born in 1860. I believe that was 160 years ago. And she was born a slave in Alabama. I want to share with you first, though, some of my experiences in terms of how I came to know the community of your community. And I'm trying to see how exactly this is going to work here. Yes. We met your community, the foundation that I work for, the Sister Clara Muhammed Schools Foundation. We met your community through travels with Brother Salvas Ozturk, who lives in New Jersey. And we've traveled on different occasions, 3 different occasions at least, with him. The first of those to Bosnia and to Turkey in 2016. And in 2018, we traveled to Amsterdam and London together. And this year, in March, we traveled to South Africa, Tanzania, and Zanzibar. And through our experiences, we've met much of the community that you all are a part of. We've met with Imam Abdullah Abe, and on several occasions, both here and in our travels. We visited several schools in South Africa and Tanzania and Zanzibar on our recent trip. with several members of our community. We've also built relationships with communities throughout the country, and I'm sure that many of you have met some of the believers from our community. I met Brother Ibrahim myself in Los Angeles, along with some of our community members in Los Angeles in December. We have strong relationships that are evolving in both New Jersey and Michigan. The Balkan Center in Michigan is, they are very great friends of mine and my wife and our community there in Michigan. And Detroit is the original home of our community life, which began in 1931 or thereabouts. And there's a lot of history to say about that, a lot of detailed history, and I'm going to have to give a very brief synopsis of that. First of all, I should introduce you to our Imam, Imam Warithuddin Muhammad. Some of you may know him. He is called America's Imam, and he became the leader of our community in 1975. He passed away in September of 2008, but his work has established us as a community of believers in the global community of Al-Islam, and not just in terms of our community development here in this country. And there's a lot to say about that. To be brief, I'll just mention his father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, we called him. He was the leader of the Nation of Islam from 1931 to 1975, when he passed away, and when Imam Warithuddin Muhammad took his place in the leadership. The movement was called then the Nation of Islam. And that movement began because of a man who was from what we now call Pakistan, or what at that time was India. He was Pashtun, and he was an Ahmadiyya Muslim. And he brought us a story that really did not fit religion itself, but did fit the purposes for how he saw our social life and our culture evolving to bring us to Islam. So it was a sort of prototypical Islam. That is, it had certain elements of Islam in it, and an emphasis on progressing in that sense once we were able to understand enough about our own condition to begin to change our focus. And he promised, his hope was, the promised hope that we would eventually come to an understanding of the Quran itself and the life example of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that was exactly what happened by Allah's mercy in 1975, when his son, Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, became the leader of the Nation of Islam at that time. And he was the one who had been prepared through his study of the Quran and through Allah's mercy and his guidance of his study to become our leader and to transform the identity and the focus to what is universal Islam in the global sense. That new beginning, if you will, we actually refer to as the second resurrection. Now, some of these things are really a biblical reference, because we were Bible people. We came out of the Christian culture of this country and its roots, but we have completely transformed our own identity and our own focus for our vision to that of the global Islamic community. There's much to say about the man who's called Farad Muhammad. He was a mystic, and he had a definite plan that we've come to understand because of the research of some of our scholars and what his intention was. And that's a very interesting history by itself, and some of you who are interested in exploring it further may be interested in studying that. Most of you are probably familiar with Muhammad Ali, who was a member of our community until his passing just recently. And probably with the exception of Barack Obama, he was probably until President Obama became the president, the most widely recognized person across the world. And all of us know of his stance, his moral and ethical stance against the Vietnam War and against the oppression of our people and in this country and across the world. And his principal stance, I'm sure most of you know, cost him his title as a heavyweight champion and the loss of his ability to earn an income for 3 years, I believe it was, of his boxing career. You're probably also familiar with El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, or Malcolm X as he's called. He actually, like many of our members, came from the urban culture of the streets of the United States. He was born in the Midwest, I think in Iowa. He had his early experience in the cities of New York and Boston, and went through a period of his life being imprisoned, where he first studied the dictionary, which is very interesting. And because of his study, he became a very eloquent spokesman for the Nation of Islam, beginning our newspaper, which was then called Muhammad Speaks. It's now called Muslim Journal. And that is the community newspaper that is still circled, that many of you may find available in your cities. He was the most articulate spokesman for the Nation of Islam, and probably most of you know the history of that to some extent, of his assassination in 1965. He was really the leading voice in our community and brought many people into our community from about the early 1950s, 1953, until 1955. Another person that some of you may be familiar with is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's one of the most noted of all the basketball players of all time. And he's not a member of our particular community, the community of Imam Waheed Muhammad. He does belong to another community, and our African American community does have several other Orthodox, as we might say, Muslim communities across the country. I want to talk a little bit about some of the history that preceded the Nation of Islam that began in the 1930s. One of those is what is called the Moorish Science Temple of America. And it was started by a man named Timothy Drew, or as he called himself, Noble Drew Ali. He established the Moorish Science Temple in Newark, New Jersey in about the same time, a little before the time of the Nation of Islam, in the early 1930s. That movement is also still alive, and it really created a real recognition of Islam, particularly through the jazz musicians of that era, many of which became exposed to Islam through the Moorish Science Temple and its teachings. There's a long history of Islamic influence in this country. In fact, right from its beginnings, two of the navigators on the ships of Christopher Columbus were in fact Moriscos, or Muslims from Spain who had been exiled or marginalized during the Spanish Inquisition. And they were actually the navigators on the ships. Now, I did share an edited narrative of a book of history called A History of Muslim African Americans from Pre-Islamic Arabia to Africa to America. And it's a very comprehensive history that was written in 2006 at the behest of our Imam Waheed Muhammad. And there are some versions of it still available. And I did share a brief synopsis that focuses on the topic that we're addressing tonight with you. So if organizers would wish to share that with those of you who wish to read it. Feel free to do so as well. The Nation of Islam I mentioned as a sort of what we call now a proto-Islamic movement. That is, its emphasis on changing the social and cultural traditions of African Americans in this country. Although there were other, and that movement still does exist, it is now headed by Minister Louis Farrakhan, who some of you may recognize his name. It still exists and still is pursuing that same sort of cultural and social agenda that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad started in the 1930s. That is not our community. If you hear that name, the community of Imam Muhammad, Mr. Farrakhan was actually a follower of Imam Muhammad from about 1975 to 1978. And then he felt that he should go back and reach out to our people in the same way that Imam Muhammad's father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, had done. I'm going to go through this a little more quickly because there's a lot to say. I do want to mention that Muslim immigrants from across the world have been coming to this country since the mid-1860s, right after the Civil War in this country. The first were mainly from Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and from other countries in the Middle East. Some of the first masjids that were built in states like North Dakota, one of the very first in the late 1800s. There were Albanian masjids established in Connecticut and also in Detroit, Michigan, in the early part of the 19th century, about 1915. So America has a rich inheritance and a rich tradition of Muslim life that did not really become prominent in the popular culture until the Nation of Islam, which is why people speak of the Nation of Islam as having planted the seeds for Islam in this country in terms of its recognition as a worldwide global influence. About 42%, and these figures vary, you'll see different ones, of the Muslims in this country are African American. There are various degrees from about 24% of South Asian Muslims, 12% of Arab Muslims, about 6% of African Muslims, and about 3% of Turkish Muslims, which would be all. I don't know if you've been able to share the picture, the PowerPoint, but there's a picture of our book there among that. And I also have a PDF.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, we can see the screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You have to forgive my being technologically challenged, but thank you very much. It's the Islamic influence from Africa, which I alluded to, we think historically can be confirmed from as early a period as the 1300s, 1313, 1316. We have historical evidence that one of the rulers of the Empire of Mali in West Africa, Mansa Abubakiri, made a voyage to this continent before Columbus. We know of Mansa Abubakiri from Mansa Musa, whose journey to Mecca in the early 1300s is famous for the fact that he crashed the global economy with his expenditure of gold. He is still considered among some the richest man of history, but he was a Muslim from Mali in West Africa, from which many of the slaves came. We think between 30% and 40% of the slaves, some people say less, actually came from the Muslim areas of West Africa. Now, there's a large story in that too, because we know that much of the memory of African American history and Muslim history was erased through the experience of chattel slavery. So that's another whole story, some of which is addressed in our book. But we also know from research by people of our community that there were remnants and syncretizations, things that were left over in our memory, in our practice, even of Christianity, and in other elements of our genetic memory. We actually believe we can affirm that came from the influence of Islam, and that kept us, in spite of our conditions, being controlled and dominated by our enslavement and then segregation and racism, that Allah put something in us and preserved something in us from Islam, and that was awakened by the movement of the Nation of Islam. I'll mention just several narratives that we have, and there are others that you can consult for those who might be interested as scholars or just in general. The autobiography of Nicholas Said is one of those. He was a slave whose story was written, and his identity as a Muslim prior to his enslavement is available still today. Yaro Mahmoud, who was a citizen who owned property in Washington, D.C., is another whose slave narratives have been recovered. There is a museum, if you're able to visit Washington, that has preserved this heritage. It's the Museum of African American Muslim History. There's also a museum in Jackson, Mississippi, for those of you who can visit it. And they're both, and I think there's also one in Philadelphia. Another very famous narrative is by a slave who was enslaved under the worst conditions in Mississippi, who was actually a prince from among the Fula people in West Africa. His name was Abdurrahman Said, and he had memorized the entire Quran before he was captured as a slave, and actually had written a version of it from his own memory as well as his own narratives. I think I included another picture from 1953, which was about the time Islam was making a real mark because of the immigration of Muslims from across the world, with the opening of the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. And if you have that picture, that's a picture of President Dwight Eisenhower and his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, at the dedication. Most of you know that in the present climate, for some years, because of the work, interfaith work and other work of Imam Muhammad, Muslims of all types now are receiving a very gracious and very warm reception in every aspect of the culture of the United States. In spite of what we've had to endure of our collective suffering because of 2001, and what you all from Imam Ghulen's community have been suffering as a group. But we know that Allah is with us, and we know that there are hopeful people in every aspect of American life, government, education, science, culture. Though we do not hear their voices clearly, we know that they are looking for all of us to make a contribution to the future of this country. I do want to mention just a couple of other things. I'll mention some of the interfaith efforts. We have a very strong relationship with the Folklore movement, our Catholic movement, and they posture themselves in terms of trying to influence interfaith work pretty much like you all do with Hizmet. Imam Muhammad, in fact, has on several occasions visited the Vatican, not just as a guest, but as the spokesman for the Muslim world at the Vatican in 1999, at the invitation of the Pope, which was a very significant event because it was the beginning of the Jubilee year, during which the Catholics opened what they call the Golden Door of the Vatican, and they do that every 25 years. And when they do so, it is to signal that people in the Catholic world can come and enter that door and receive God's mercy. Now, that is their ritual. But in the year preceding to that, they invited all of the religious people of the world to that event, to the opening of that year prior to that event. And Imam Wahiduddin Muhammad, our leader, America's Imam, was the spokesman on that occasion at the Vatican. I think that's it. We'll just stop. I'm probably over my 40 minutes. And I will be happy to entertain any questions. And I thank you all for bearing patiently with the little technological difficulty. And I'm very grateful for our brothers arranging for you to be able to see the presentation.
Dr. El-Amin, thank you for this great presentation. Of course, the 40 minutes won't encompass this long story, which the African American, as you said, like the majority of Muslims in America constitute, and they have great contributions to the Islam's understanding in America, from Malcolm X to Muhammad Ali and to Imam W.D. Muhammad, a Nation of Islam leader, Elijah Muhammad, and so many other figures that live in our present time that guide us like the stars in the sky. I have a question that came through social media, if that is okay.
Yes, certainly.
The first question is, what do you think the greatest need for African American brothers in Islam are in the US for upward mobility? What kind of contributions can we make, or do our brothers in Islam from the African American community need at this time?
I'll say it this way. I think that our community has already received a great reward through the commentary and the vision of Imam Wahiduddin Muhammad into the Quran. And that itself is a redeeming factor. The process of applying that to our daily life is our everyday work in our community. And that is taking place in every city across this country, and very quietly, just as you all in Hizmet go about doing your work in the service of Allah and this deen in this country. I'll make this statement, and I do stand upon it personally, as most of us do, who have followed Imam Muhammad for the last, whatever it is, 25, 35, 45 years. We consider Imam Muhammad the Mujaddid of this age. And perhaps even more so, but we'll leave that more so alone. We believe that what he has given us is in line with what we were promised, or what was promised to the Prophet and his Sahaba. And that is the universal vision that is promised that will awaken mankind globally. So that is the great reward that we believe that we have inherited as a responsibility, and by God's mercy. So that's the development of our inner life is in our hands, and we feel very comfortable in pursuing that. We are in this present moment, in fact, just because of this present crisis in the world, seeing that our connections with other communities, especially Hizmet and our folklore friends that I mentioned and other communities, that these connections, these efforts to collaborate, as this occasion is a mercy from Allah in spite of the conditions that we see in the world. And we know that Allah says that clearly, that even in the moment of great trials and troubles, and in the midst of a plague, that there is mercy for the believers. So we're trying to reach out to other communities, especially you all, and your efforts, and find ways to collaborate. And that is something that we're still thinking through and we're working at. But this certainly is a magnificent occasion for making that effort, since we're now getting to know each other in a different way.
Exactly. Thank you for that. And to our audience, please don't hesitate to write your questions on our YouTube live chat channel that you see on the right-hand side of there's a column that goes below. So please don't hesitate to write your questions. Another question comes through our social media account, which is, do you think there is enough interaction between the immigrant Muslims and the African-American Muslim community here in the U.S.?
There is a considerable amount of interaction, especially with you all, with your community. I've said that. We are needing to increase that. And the general answer is no. We could have much more of interaction, but these personal kinds of connections that have formed, for example, with us in our travels, just a handful of us, they are the means of advancing these bigger opportunities that we hope will blossom, especially into education, as a primary mode for advancing the influence of Islam. And I know you all have many schools across the country. I'm familiar with them personally, especially the schools in Michigan. Brother Augustan, who is the principal of that, the school in Michigan, is a personal friend of mine, and the people at the Balkan Center there in Detroit. So yes, but these are small things now that we hope will become bigger, and we hope that all of you in your community will reach out to people in our community. And I always tell people that the way we met, the Hizmet community is different from any other group of Muslims, because our brothers came to us in the cause of our social need. In fact, it was the need to travel to Turkey. And we didn't know very much about the Hizmet movement at all at the time. But the grace and mercy of Allah brought us together. And that's a wonderful approach to what is required if we are, as Muslims, going to, in fact, extend our efforts into the cause of the global world. That is, our social concerns should be first. And you all have already set a great example of that.
Yeah, thank you for this. The Senator Chucker is asking if you can provide a list of books or resources that you mentioned in your presentation, Dr. El-Amin.
I can. I will forward that. I do have a copy of, I do have a bibliography of some literature. And there is also a website that I might direct you to for those who are interested. If Brother Ibrahim, if you'll remind me, I would certainly forward that.
Yeah, that'd be great if you can share it through our social media.
I might mention a few. Some of the sources are well known. Black Muslims in America by C. Eric Lincoln, but whoever may be interested in the background history. The autobiography of Malcolm X. There are probably several books that you might find on Muhammad Ali and his associated with the Nation of Islam. One of our publishers that you can consult, and you can do this immediately. You can go online and you can Google WDM Publications. That is Imam Waziruddin Muhammad's son. He publishes an enormous amount of his father's literature, his YouTube videos, and there's a whole mass of information there that has to do with Imam Muhammad's commentary, which is vast and voluminous. And I think that's why, that's why I consider him and Imam Gulen, and this is me. No one told me to say this. I consider him, Imam Gulen, and Imam Saeed Nursi, just from what I know and the little study that I have done, as Mujaddid.
I see. Thank you. Another question that comes is African American Muslim community went through lots of struggles here in the US. Some of these struggles are still ongoing. What will be your recommendation to newcomer Hizmet community in the US that is going through similar experiences?
I had the same discussion twice, once in Houston 2 years ago, and in Amsterdam with the community there. By the way, Imam Wazir Muhammad's daughter, Layla, works for Brother Salvas Ozturk in Newark, New Jersey, and she will be another wonderful person for you all to have on one of your programs. Yes, we see our struggle reflected in your struggle. You had to, many of you, flee your homes, leaving behind your wealth and your family, your customs and your culture. We were forcefully removed. It has taken us 400 years to overcome that, and we're still trying to overcome it. I do not believe that your struggle will last that long, inshallah. And I know that the situation is difficult for many of you. I personally know people that we met in Istanbul who lost all of what they had amassed. They are our friends. They are my personal friends. The thing that you all have as an advantage is you have connections across the globe. You have support. Unlike those of us who were initially brought to this country who were cut off completely from everything in terms of our culture and our connection with our African roots. You have dedicated and committed leadership. They are an example for not only promoting the interests of Islam across the globe, they are responsible for setting an example for Muslims across the globe as well, and for human beings, all of humanity, in this country and across the globe. You have resources, you have your education, you have a community life. Those are things that the African American was completely stripped from. We also believe that this is a day that we call the day of religion, and that the religious people of every sort are coming together. And we believe that the Muslims across the globe, and particularly the Muslims in this country, are the greatest influence in terms of promoting that day of religion for all religion. And I've already tried to say that you all are already positioned in terms of your influence in this country, and by working so graciously and so tirelessly and having such profound leadership and other resources, you are the partners that Allah has chosen in this country for advancing that cause. So let us go forth together.
Yeah, I believe Hizmet has a lot to learn from the authentic understanding of being Muslim in America. You're true examples of American Muslims here in this country. Another question that comes to through our social media is, what do you recommend to the Muslims in the US who are scared / embarrassed of their faith? What do you recommend to them?
I would recommend that they take our example and the lesson of our courage. Our sisters were wearing hijab in the 1950s when African American people were being hung and lynched. And they wore their hijab, if you want to call it that now, openly. And it earned a kind of respect and a kind of authority and influence in this country that has profited us by being courageous in representing our Muslim life. There are people that behind closed doors, they respect Islam. People that, I won't even mention the organizations that they belong to, that know Islam is the truth. They go all the way back to the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, whose Quran we still have, and his extensive notes are in the Library of Congress in Washington. We know he studied this religion, and I don't think there's anybody that would dispute that his study of this religion influenced this democracy. So take hope in that. This is not something new in terms of his influence on this democracy. We believe as African Americans in our struggle that I wish you could see the last picture. I didn't send it. I think it's in this version. But it's a picture of my wife and I on Mount Arafat, and imposed in 2006, and imposed over it is a poem that kind of captures our history. And if I have a minute, I'll read it to you. And the sense of what our struggle has been, in spite of all of the things that we've endured, but at the present moment, I can tell you, look to our spirit if you can't find it in yourself, and see that Allah's hand is on us, and his mercy and his guidance and his forgiveness is on all of us, not just some of us. So be brave, be courageous, be faithful. Stick to what you have, what you know. Follow your leadership.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. El-Amin, for this beautiful conversation. We have 4 questions covered with beautiful answers. What would you say in closing to our audience that are listening now?
I think the thing to say is that we're living at a historic moment. In fact, I'll put it in the context that we understand it. I remember Emmett Till, who some of you may know, and how his body was mutilated. I remember that. I was 10 years or 11 years old. I know how it changed the African Americans' attitude toward our social situation and brought about the civil rights movement. I include among my friends not only Imam Muhammad's daughter, I also include among my friends Dr. Martin Luther King's oldest daughter. Many of the people that we read about in the history of our people and the civil rights movement, I have met or I know personally, Muhammad Ali and many others. That same issue now has become a global issue and a global awareness, and that is going to play out in ways that we perhaps don't see currently, that are going to bring Islam toward the forefront. It's already happening quietly. The leadership, the imams and the leadership in our community are consulted by the political establishment in Washington. They have said to us, they're waiting on us, the Muslims in particular, the African American Muslims, to ready ourselves to contribute to what they know as the future. In education, we have built relationships with the folklore universities that are under the auspices of the Vatican. We have built relationships with philanthropic organizations across the Muslim world. We have built relationships with the top universities in this country who hear our voice and respect our voice and invite us just as you do. So we don't see it yet, but this is the day of religion, and it is we, the Muslims, that will have perhaps the telling or most important influence on that day of religion.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There's one question that I missed that came through social media. Often we hear so many positive things about African American Muslim chaplaincy in prisons. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, that was a major effort. I'm not sure exactly when it started. I know that Malcolm X, and the fact that he came out of prison, some of the most notorious prisons, Walpole in Massachusetts, and he lived the gang life. So he was a major influence of being able to say to people that they can redeem themselves. And I suppose that's where we got the big emphasis are going into the prisons to try and bring Islam to those among our people and others who were the most downtrodden people. And that continues to be an effort on our part. I can give you stories. One of our very most studious and informed students of Al Quran and Imam Muhammad came out of the streets and the gangster life of Chicago, Imam Qasim Ahmed. And his commentary and his life example to us as a person who came out of that environment is a profound example in and of itself. And we have many of those. I just point him out. Some of you may know of his work. I don't know if he ever came out as far as Huntington Beach or that part of the States, but he did a lot of work in Houston among the immigrant community. And we have other voices like that. In fact, I would encourage you to invite some of our imams who have done that sort of work, both in the prison and in the African American community too, perhaps to this kind of program in the future. They can give you their personal experience, their life experience, and the fact that it is only by Allah's mercy that has brought us out of that condition.
Thank you. Now, there's, I've been always saying last, but the question keep pouring in. There's one question that comes: what can we do to help our youth become more integrated with our religion?
There's a real disconnect between our youth and our community as well. I think you have to keep persistently doing what you do. You all do a great job. I know also involving your youth in your cultural life and your everyday kinds of things. We have to solve certain problems. One is the identity problem that our youth have in this culture, and particularly our males. We have to go back, and we've started this work, some of our imams, and I've talked about it, of bringing forth a vision for what manhood is for our boys, because they are the ones who become most subject to the negative influence in this culture. We also have to educate our youth, all of us, about the nature of this culture and how it is postured to really corrupt them. In fact, to take the life, not only their life in this world, but to really kill their own good nature and their soul. So that's not a conversation we have yet. We promote our religion, we promote our rituals, we promote our charity, we promote our prayers, but we have to address the youth culture. And as an African American, there are youth that are doing it themselves, but we, especially the older generation, we have to take that into account. And that's a discussion that some of you may want to have with some of the people in our community too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. El-Amin, for this beautiful conversation and the Q&A's session and your closing remarks, joining us at this very busy time of yours and everybody else's, I suppose, in this new normalcy. And we'd like to thank our audience for joining us at this week's Salam Islamic Center, a brief history of Muslim African Americans here in the U.S. Thank you for making this happen, Dr. El-Amin.
And thank Allah for all of you.
Thank you.